I could observe the action there. They were in the hill. We were fighting, tracers, bunkers blowing up. What do you do as a last resort? You call in airburst, hoping to defeat the attack. I had 3 lieutenants in all, 2 killed. I lost a total of 11 Marines, or 13 Marines in a 13-month tour. That's 2 lieutenants, 2 sergeants, 1 corporal, 5 lance corporals, 2 PFCs, and 1 private. And I say a prayer for them every morning. My name is Gilbert Bolton, nicknamed Gib. I was born in Portsmouth, Ohio, 11 March 1941. I attended school in Portsmouth. At the age of 18, or shortly before that, I saw a John Wayne movie, The Sands of Iwo Jima, and I immediately was attracted to the character called Sergeant Stryker, and that initiated my desire to go into the Marine Corps. Later, I enlisted in Cincinnati, and I flew out to San Diego, MCRD, in December of 1959. Went through recruit training, and believe it or not, while there at training, I got baptized. And I've often been asked since then, they said, well, why did you get baptized in boot camp? I said, well, I thought they was going to kill me. So I've completed recruit training, went up to 2nd ITR at Camp Pendleton, and from there I was assigned to the Pioneer Battalion because I helped my father as a plumber in the summers, and they tried to match you up with what you were supposed to be good at doing in the Marine Corps. So they assigned me to the Pioneer Battalion, which is now Combat Engineers. As a private, I was cleaning out the company commander's office, and he walked in, and I was admiring a sign behind his desk that said, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. And he said, Private, do you like that sign? What else you going to say? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I'll make you a deal. If you can have every private in the company know what that sign says, I'll give it to you at graduation. He says, is that a deal? I said, yes, sir. What else am I going to say? He said, but if I find a Marine that does not know what that sign says, you're going to have to run up that hill called Academy Hill, which is presently behind the Staff NCO Academy at the School of Infantry. So the privates, they had it in for me, so when they asked, they naturally said they didn't know. And when we returned to the company area, the company commander would always say, Private Bolton to the company office. And those other privates would start laughing because they knew I was going to have to run that hill. And I run it, I don't know how many times. The bottom line is, at graduation time, he said, well, you didn't have everybody in the company know what that sign says, and you've run that hill many times. He said, what else would you prefer to have? I said, I want to be in the infantry, and that's how I got assigned to the infantry from a Pioneer Battalion. So I completed the 2nd ITR training, and I reported to the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, Bravo Company at Las Pogas. I spent almost 3.5 years with that company. I had good mentors. They were, the company grade officers were all from Korea. The staff NCOs were from Korea. The field grade officers were from World War II. And we trained hard. The only Marines that had automobiles in those days were staff NCOs and officers. We'd go to the field Monday afternoon and come back Thursday. We stayed out in the field and we trained. Thursday we'd come back in, clean weapons all day Friday, and Saturday morning was a half work day. That's when you had weapons inspection. And if you flunked the inspection, you went into the duty platoon for the weekend. And you started over again the next week. We spent a lot of time in the field, learned a lot of things. That's when I was introduced to combat leadership briefs that I used later on in my career. And the way that happened, if you met the company commander's learning objectives, Thursday or Wednesday evening, you got to be at administrative bivouac. And you would be around the fire in your platoon area, and they would call up combat veterans that had been in combat, and they'd tell their stories. And that's how I learned the combat leadership concept and how I introduced them later on in the training. So that was a learning lesson. And we started out learning individual skills, then fire team, then squad, then we advanced up to platoon, and then we went to battalion size, and that was our lock-on training prior to deploying overseas on a ship as a floating battalion. After a couple years, I'd made the rank of corporal, got to go to NCO school, learned all those skills. We went to Camp Swab. At Camp Swab, on some of our training, we went down to Naha, we boarded submarines, and we had rubber boat training off Camp Swab. Next phase of training is we went up to the northern training area, to the jungle training. And we learned all about squad patrols and rappelling and bivouacking and all those skills needed to know to operate effectively as a squad. I was a squad leader then. So I signed an AA form, went up to Marine Barracks Yokosuka. I was assigned to the brig section, assigned, not in the brig. So I re-enlisted after the tour there to go to the drill field down in San Diego. Re-enlisted 6 years. Went down to San Diego, was assigned to the 3rd Battalion L Company. And I spent time as a sergeant. I was promoted as a staff sergeant. Spent 2 years. That was 64 to 66. Vietnam was just getting started. I wanted to go to Vietnam bad. I was afraid I was going to miss it. So I kept trying to leave early. They said not yet. And at that time, I was the sole surviving son, so I had to have my mother's permission at the age of 24 to go to Vietnam. So I told my mom, I said, well, if you don't sign, I'm going to sign it anyway and go. So anyway, she approved, and one of those administrative requirements. And I shipped out, flew out of March Air Force Base after we went through training at Camp Pendleton. And I reported to the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines in December. They were just coming back from an operation. I wanted to be a platoon sergeant, and all the platoon sergeant billets were filled. So they put me in as the assistant operations chief. I hated that, but I learned a lesson that every job you're assigned to, you're going to learn something that will be beneficial. And I was there for about 30 days. I learned to see how the battalion operated, and more importantly, how the Fire Support Coordination Center operated. I got to spend time with the CAP unit for a week, so I got to see the big picture, which all paid off later in my career. At that time, we were getting ready to go to Operation Desoto as a battalion. Went down to Chulai. We didn't know where we was going, but the old-timers said, when they start making the battalion TO, you get all your records up to date, and you fanfare your weapons. You're going someplace that's going to be hot. And sure enough, The place we went to was called Duck Foe, and the operation was Operation Desoto. We flew out of an airfield, flew into Duck Foe. That was an area that was occupied by NVA for R&R and training. It was between 1 Corps and 2 Corps. Never been penetrated by American forces before. 3-7, and we were called Task Force X-Ray with additional units attached. We landed into the LZs at first light, took a lot of casualties. And that day we set up around Nui Dang, the battalion, and the companies were spread out around that particular area. So I spent a little time there as the assistant ops chief, and then casualties due to the landing required them to shift a lot of people. A lot of staff NCOs and officers were casualties. So at this time I got to come out from an assistant ops chief. I was assigned out to Mike Company, which was on a hill called Saw Bend. I relieved a staff sergeant named Staff Sergeant Judy. He had 81 experience, so he was going to take the replacement of the 81 officer who was a casualty, and I was going to take Staff Sergeant Judy's replacement. So that began my tour as a platoon sergeant. The night before, Mike Company, they dropped a bomb on Mike Company, a large crater. That crater looked like a volcano. So I took over the 2nd platoon. On the 1st patrol, I got indoctrinated. I took the 1st platoon out on a patrol, and we were spread out in a column, and we were hit by enemy fire, and everybody got down, and I can recall some NVA or sappers riding a bicycle down, shooting weapons at the head of the column, and some 60 mortar rounds landed in the rice paddies. This was my baptism to fire, the first time I'd ever been fired or shot at in anger. We had casualties up front. I tried to crawl up, and they were killed by the bicycle riding NVA or sappers, whoever they were. The thing that got us out of there, we called in artillery to suppress them. They broke contact. We continued on with the patrol and returned back to the company area. That was my first patrol, my first baptism to fire, and I got to see how the platoon operated, and in my opinion, they needed a lot of training. They had a lot of bad habits, so we started the retraining period right then and there. Before I came to Vietnam, I took out all the correspondence courses I could and asked all the questions of returning veterans on what to do, what to expect. So while I was waiting to go to Vietnam, I completed the MCI courses on the rifle squad, rifle platoon, rifle company, and functions of an infantry staff NCO, and I referred to those many times in Vietnam. And that's when I started retraining that platoon to do the right things. And you hear some of these people say, well, you don't do that stuff in combat. I said, how do you think you learned how to operate in combat? Those are books written from experiences in combat. So I had to break a lot of bad habits. I went out with every squad, and we did ambushes by the book. We did river crossings by the book. Anything we had to do, I brought those manuals with me, and I kept them in a little plastic bag. And if we were going to do something the next day, I would look and read and see how it was done, and we did it by the book. And they saw the value of it, and we become a very proficient platoon on that couple months that we spent down there at Duck Foe. That was my orientation and indoctrination of that platoon. When we left, I felt they were properly trained. From there, we went back up to Hill 37. The same area that we left, we took over from 1-4 who had been there. And we spent a week or so in the battalion area, and we ran patrols out of there in and around the area. And then eventually they moved Mike Company west. Mike Company went to Hill 52. As a 2nd platoon, we were assigned to Hill 25, and we moved by foot to Hill 25. The company went by helicopter to Hill 52. And there was a company on 25. They removed it, and we took over that company position. First thing we did, got up on the hill. I sat in the platoon, and I broke out my map, and I started studying the ranges of all the weapons available to us. 81s was on Hill 52. They were out of range. So on Hill 65 was artillery. So if we were going to have supporting arms, it had to come from artillery. So I got a hold of the Audie officer on Hill 52, and I said, I need your presence down here as soon as possible so we could register some artillery. So the next morning he came down and he registered some artillery concentrations, which later you'll hear that paid off in the defense of Hill 25 in the attack by the sappers. So he came down and he registered some concentrations and numbered them. Also got grid coordinates for center of the hill, the impact area, if we had to call artillery in on us. So we set in and began to develop the hill, building bunkers, running patrols, etc. Our daily activity, the way I run it, we had 3 squads, weapons attached. According to doctrine, it's good that you pass through your designated ambush site in the daytime so you know how to get there at nighttime. So the squad in the morning would go out, complete their patrol, pass through the designated ambush site, return, sleep in that afternoon. The next squad would go out in the afternoon, and the 3rd squad would be preparing for the next morning. So it was 2 patrols. The morning patrol was the ambush, and then when they came off the ambush, they would have the morning off, and we just rotate just like that in a sequence. 2 up, 1 down, rotation. That's the way I ran my routine. On Hill 25, we continued to train, and we taught squad leaders and Marines how to call for fire. The area was a free fire zone, so the way I would teach the squad leaders how to call for fire, once they completed their patrol on the way back in, they would call for a formation into Charlie Ridge, and we called it H&I, harassing interdictory fire. And of course, the battery, we considered the battery to be our own special battery because we fired them a couple times a day, and they liked to fire artillery mission. So we had a pretty good relationship with them. And in addition to that, they'd have an AO, a plane come over with an observer from the artillery, and he'd check in on our frequency and net. And if we wanted to call for fire, he'd relay that back, and we had a good relationship. Charlie Ridge, the height was 1075. Between Charlie Ridge and between 52 and 25, I believe, was a travel corridor that the NVA traveled. They didn't have a specific path to follow. It was just between 2 terrain features that they would come down and cross the river. And at that point, they could wade across the river. And that was the crossing point, and that was between 52 and 25. We had a lot of activity there. We engaged the enemy on several occasions there, and that was one area. Another time, the VC would come down out of the high ground down into the village. I called the VC probably coming down out of their lighthouse Charlie because they'd always flip a light. But they was such a great distance from us, I took a lensatic compass and I zeroed in on a sandbag. Then the next day, I checked the location in the daylight. We sent out an ambush in that location and got them coming down. That was a confirmed. I'll tell you another story there, that same area. They were coming down routinely, and they always had a practice of checking for their dead if they lost somebody. So I decided to send out 2 ambushes. I sent one out early with a pair of utilities stuffed with weeds and everything to look like a body. And they set up on a sandbar on one side, and the other ambush went at another location that covered the same area. And at a predetermined radio check, the first ambush would fire across that sandbar as if they had to trip the ambush. And then they'd go out as if searching, and they would put down the utilities filled with weeds stretched out on the sandbar, looked like they had a confirmed kill. And on the way back, they would fire M79 rounds, HE rounds, and whoever was watching them would think that patrol would return to the base. And the other one sat poised and ready, covering the same area. True to form, they came down to check out that ambush and that body, and we whacked them with the second ambush and got a couple. They always like to come and check for their dead, and that's when we would whack them. So those were the kind of games we played, and I liked to play those kind of games. The way we prepped night ambushes, the squad going out would come up prior to the ambush departure. We'd tell them the location, the checkpoints, any information received from the battalion pertaining to the area. Hold an inspection, make sure they had their proper gear, ammo, gear that they were required to take, radio check, and then they get ready to depart after dark and depart friendly lines and move out to their designated ambush site. The front gate had a radio, and we had a radio in the CP there to monitor. And of course, they'd have to give radio checks by hand clicks, all secure, key your handset one or twice, and they'd get radio checks that way, all secure while they was in the ambush site. After a certain time, they were required to come back through the fence line. They'd have to identify themselves as coming in with a password and then be allowed to enter. We had the gate where it was crooked. It'd be winding so you couldn't walk directly in. And then once in, the patrol leader would check in with the CP, secure the gear, and then they would secure their positions. Every squad leader had a map. And of course there, Hill 25, we got to know the terrain because we did it repeatedly. And you use landmarks, and you can quickly reference landmarks and find them on the map. Map reading is very important, as you know. And you always tried to teach all the young Marines how to read a map, and you'd stop periodically and educate them in the process. That's the way you did it. Use points of references, well-known points of references. Repetition is the mother of character and skill. You do it over and over and over and over again. And of course, Hill 25, we operated in that area continually, so you knew where you were at all times. You always had Marines that were better on point than others. You rotated the radios so everybody knew how to operate the radio, and yes, everybody cross-trained. They knew what to do. For example, if you're moving in a column and you get hit from the flank, you immediately turn to the right and charge that position. You never want to lay down and let them continue to shoot you. So it's either right, immediate action left, But what you want to do is turn to the direction and fire back and charge. You just don't want to sit there and be fired upon. Attention to detail is the cornerstone of everything you do. Map reading, drills, cleaning weapons, policing the area, it all, just like when they left the wire on a patrol, they maintained distance, kept their weapons off their shoulder, pointed left and right, didn't have all this crap over their helmets and stuff hanging out. They were dressed properly, no talking. When the round started, you holler, scream anything you want, but there's no talking while you're moving. And an NVA unit or any unit, they want to attack the sloppy unit, not the one that's ready. And 3 radios helped a lot, one for each squad, because now you had a maneuvering unit, each squad. When they're out on patrols like that, you got to monitor and listen to them and know what's going on. And you worry about them like a kid going out on his first date. We'll make sure he gets home safe. Attention to detail pays dividends in combat. That was always my philosophy. You dress the same. You put your gear the same. So if you had to look for it in the nighttime on a casualty, you knew where the maps and the compasses were located. You loaded your magazines 18 rounds instead of the max 20 so it wouldn't decompress the spring. I used to have a magazine for the squads loaded with nothing but tracers. And they carried that in the rear of their cartridge belt, and that was the ambush magazine they used. Just can you imagine a squad, boom, nothing but tracers. Just little things like that. And down at Duck Foe, when we had to turn in all our weapons, I turned in all the weapons for the M14s except 3. I kept one for each squad that had a selector on it and a bipod. And then I would take the belted machine gun, 7.62 rounds, and pull them out of the belt and load magazines for the 14s. But those 3 M14s saved us a lot of times, just like having the old BAR, an automatic weapon. And they had a grenade launching capability, which the new rifles didn't at the time. And I had 1 Marine each squad carry that M14. And that was just like the automatic weapon for squad, for ambushes. And it paid dividends. I'd send, on a daytime patrol, I'd send a 60 mortar out with the patrol with an old M19 60 mortar with a pack board loaded with mortar rounds. And for example, if they didn't have a target of opportunity prior to coming back in, they would expend the rounds, set up along the river and fire them across the river into Arizona territory, some hamlet areas. So we did that. We carried mortars. I sent out machine guns daytime patrols, but not night ambushes. Every Marine knew how to navigate, and I'd try to rotate as many Marines as possible up to call for fire, so they knew how to call for fire. And it got to be, we were in the same area, so basically the same grid coordinates. And we could fire any time, daytime H&Is harassing interdictory fires. And each squad fired a formation before returning to the base camp. So that's how they got in their practical application. And Amtraks would come out that way. There was a couple blown up. They carried the PX supplies and everything. And they had a bad habit of going out real secure, but they had a bad habit of coming back in their tracks because they thought it was secure. And they had a couple of the enemy come out and put a mine in one of the track, and then it got blowed up. We had to go down with the squad and provide security at night around it till they could extract it. I remember doing that. The explosive was like a bend in the road, and you couldn't see it from either hill, and that's when they planted it. So we sent a squad down to set in one night. As I recall, we killed the person that set the bomb or the explosive, as I recall. One time there was an operation over in Arizona Territory, and we were just to provide a blocking force on our side. They set up tanks with searchlights that would alternate, and the NVA was trying to cross the river to get on our side. And they used reeds to breathe through and was crossing the river. And those tanks turned on the lights, and they were shooting them in the water as they was coming over to our side. And on an operation over in the Arizona Territory, we had the point, and I used to use them multiple columns spread out where they could see each other, and they leapfrogged. They couldn't talk. I had a radio in each one, a machine gun outboard, a 3.5 in the center, and we leapfrog, and we keyed our handsets, and then they'd move. And there was an NVA watching one column, and the other would come up to the flank, and he got startled and ran, and we killed him. I went up and checked that NVA. He was NVA hardcore. And I looked at him, and he was perfectly dressed, weapon clean, camouflaged. And I told myself, I said, boy, if they all look this good, we're in trouble. You always respect them, never did anything to their bodies, pull their teeth or cut their limbs off or stuff like that. And you never took pictures with a dead NVA or VC. My policy was, well, except down in Duck Foe when I went out with each squad so that I knew that they knew how to do it properly. But I told the lieutenant and myself it was never a policy to leave the hill unless 2/3 of the platoon went, because you're the quarterback. They're the team. If they need assistance on the radio, you had to coordinate all that stuff. You couldn't be out on some ambush and not run the whole operation from the hill. And most of the time, I think it was 10 months out of the 13 months, I was the platoon leader. There wasn't any lieutenants. So when there's not a lieutenant, you're a platoon, you're the lieutenant. And then your senior sergeant becomes your platoon sergeant. And then when they assign a lieutenant, you got a brand new lieutenant, and you got to bring him along. You can teach him confidence just like a new squad leader. You know, whenever you held a meeting or something, the lieutenant be saying something, and then they'd all look, see if you were showing any rejection, you know. So you just got to train him like you do a new squad leader, and go over everything. And now you brief them, Lieutenant, and you became just like brothers. But I only had 3 lieutenants. 2 of them were killed, and I ran the show, so to speak.
And at the end of the summer, you got Lieutenant Deneen.
Yes. So we were there on the hill, routine. I had to go to Da Nang to be interviewed by the general for a recommendation of a commission, field commission. See, I was recommended that after coming off Operation Desoto. Well, when I left the hill, I left reluctantly, and I had briefed the lieutenant what to do in case of any action, because he had everything registered, all the dead areas that you couldn't see from the hill. Mortars, artillery, use supporting arms, never send a Marine where you can send a bullet. The bigger the bullet, the best. That was the philosophy. Don't leave the hill unless you take the whole platoon with you, because you're in charge of the platoon, not the squad. And just like drill, you think there's a 1-count pause between the preparatory command and the command execution. Think before you act. And those were all lessons that I tried to teach him. So anyway, I had to go back, fly down into Da Nang, and then wait the next morning to go talk to the assistant division commander. And I remember his name, General LaHue, The division commander was out. They brought me in this big office. He had a big wall map in there. And he read the recommendations. He asked me what I'd done since I'd been in country, and I explained down at Duckfo, and he said, well, tell me about that. And then he asked me about the enemy, and he said, well, show me on the map where you were at. So I get out and give a little brief. And he said, well, I highly recommend you. So anyway, it was approved, and I left country before I actually got it. To get that recommendation, you had to have the recommendation to company commander, battalion commander, regimental commander, and I didn't have the GCT, so they had to retest me back in Da Nang. And you know, after you've been in combat and everything, you're not thinking along those lines. I think I was 1 point short, and they wavered it. And I got to spend Liberty there one night in Da Nang waiting to see, and I said, my gosh, these people are soft back here. I went down, I had a few at the club, and I went back and slept on a canvas cot in a Quonset hut. It was like at the Hotel Hilton, you know, after coming off 25, because I spent the whole tour in the field. And then I came back, flew back to Hill 37. That's when they told me the hill had been hit and a lieutenant had been killed. And I would have given that whole experience just to have been there. I felt bad, still do about it. It wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. Because when I left the hill to go back to be interviewed for a commission, I told him when I left, I said, don't leave this hill under any circumstances. You're in charge unless you take the whole platoon with you. I said, you got mortars, you got artillery, every dead space has been registered so you can use supporting arms. Don't leave this hill. And then they probed the hill by firing on the hill, and that's how Lieutenant Deneen was killed. He left the hill to try to capture, as it said, that VC, and they planted a booby trap. But if I'd have been there, that wouldn't have happened. I felt bad about that. He was young, and he was a good officer. From Hill 25, we were engaged in what they call a Sparrowhawk. We were designated to duty platoon. They had a recon unit up on top of the hill in the Ashall Valley. So I had to round up the platoon, get down to the LZ. They're going to bring in helicopters, pick us up. Another platoon would come down and replace us. So we went out to the Ashall Valley. That was an NVA haven out there. And you had a lot of leeches out there. We didn't have any contact. And the next morning they came down. There was a big, tall gunnery sergeant who was a KIA. And they brought him down off the hill, and they lifted him out in the LZ. And then shortly we were lifted out as well. But that was a normal Sparrowhawk mission, you know. And then we returned to the hill and continued on with our operations there off the hill. On November 1st, it was 1967. It was just a normal day. There was intelligence reports coming down, a lot of NVA activity reported. You could expect attacks or within the tactical area of responsibility from Hill 37 to 52 to the surrounding areas. And be ready. Later on that night, they hit Hill 37. They hit the Dialogue District, where they assassinated the leaders down there. Hill 37 reportedly got 18 rounds of incoming mortar rounds. They probed the Hill 65 just with small arms fire. There was a cap unit located at the bottom of Hill 65 where they attacked that. And then they hit Hill 25 with a reported sapper battalion, which numbered anywhere from 100 to 150 normally. And they hit Hill 52, just probed it to keep them pinned down, but the main attack was on us, I believe. They wanted to annihilate us. We were a constant thorn in their activities in and around the area. We probably had more confirmed kills over the period of that time there than Hill 52 or 65, because we were in the travel corridor between Charlie Ridge and the Vugai River, where they crossed to go over into the Arizona territory. Now that's only my suspect. So on about 0200 to November 1967, we were hit with mortars. The sappers came in, they probed the war, they came through the war, they carried satchel charges, and their technique was to use satchel charges with no shrapnel producing. They just noise and shock. As they come into your position, they'd throw them at you, you'd duck down, and they'd run by your positions. That was one of their tactics. They carried a lot of satchel charge, demolitions. They knew what they was going out on that hill. They knew every position, where the ammo bunker was at, because they're up in Charlie Ridge with a pair of binoculars looking down there like a sand table. Here we are way out in the middle of the rice paddies, sticking up like a gopher mole, and all. They knew where everything was at. They knew our routine, everything. And the main attack, so I understand, came from the western between Hill 52. Where was I? I was in the CP there, and I was helping standing radio watch. Wachico was on the radio at that time when it was hit. I came out of there. The CP that was collapsed, destroyed. I moved away from him. He probably sought cover one place, I don't know. I just knew that I had to get to the other radio, and I knew where it was located, and that's the direction I moved, which was located in Pappy's Smith's position on the opposite side of the hill. Pappy was had the other machine gun. He was on the northern side of the hill. The lieutenant was down in Sumter's bunker with him, and Sumter's bunker was near the LZ and the head on the eastern side of the hill. He chose to be down there. I was up with the radio, listening, monitoring. So anyway, they dropped some mortar rounds on, and the main attack was the sappers from various points around. They came through the wire itself. They attacked the mortar position. They knew exactly what positions they were going to. They blew the ammo bunker. They fired up into the tower. Some were killed outright. There was a hand-to-hand. Corporal Amendola, he left the mortar pit prior to the attack. And Lance Corporal Bates was left on the mortar, and the attack happened. Amendola, prior to coming to Vietnam, went to the language school, learned the Vietnamese language up at Monterey. He was promoted PFC out of recruit training at Paris Island. He was a good young Marine, muscular built, from Deposit, New York, small town. His father was a highway patrol, and he had a couple of siblings, brothers, so forth. He joined the Marine Corps at 19. He was in Vietnam. He came to my platoon as a mortar squad leader, a corporal. In the attack, he could see the mortar pit, and it was being overrun by 3 sappers. Inside, Bates was killed, and they were attempting to disassemble the mortar. In fact, they did disassemble. Corporal Amendola got up from his position, and he ran toward the position screaming in the Vietnamese language. He ran, jumped in the middle of the mortar pit, wrestled the barrel back that weighed 18 pounds, used it as a baseball bat. He himself was killed by small arms fire. He received the Navy Cross for his actions. So that was part of the battle. They was destroying bunkers. I don't know if there was individual hand fighting or not. There was some Marines out attempting to attack them. They were killed. A couple other Marines decorated for their actions. Sergeant Shoemaker on that flank of the hill that was hit with the main force. They blew the hole in the wire. He attempted to take a reaction force and charge into that position. He was killed outright. He received a Silver Star, Sergeant Shoemaker. So there was sustained fighting going in there, firing going on. In the initial moments of the battle, I had moved. The primary radio in the tent was destroyed. I moved from the tent to the secondary radio in a gun position. I made the determination to call for artillery on our own position as a last resort. At least I thought it was a last resort. You're either going to make it or you ain't going to make it. They were inside the perimeter now. It was VT, final call for fire. Now, I think I said something like it, fire for effect. We're going to be dead anyway or killed anyway or something in that order. And they hesitated. I said, fire for effect, over. Meaning they didn't believe me, I guess. It's a last resort to break the attack. We had rehearsed what to do, and that's to get into your bunkers. And if they didn't get the word, they knew the first air burst that was coming. So they had been trained to do that. We signaled, and they knew if they didn't hear it, the first air burst, they knew what was coming. And they fired individual rounds, 6 individual rounds over the center of the position. Now, before I did that, there's gunfire going on, explosions going on, tracers all over the area, fighting, hollering, screaming, dead falling. I asked the good Lord to help me make that right decision. And it wasn't any 5-paragraph order. It was just, Lord, help me. I'd never called in an artillery mission like that. I knew the effect it would have, and we had planned for it, and we even rehearsed it on occasion. If we ever get hit or overtaken, we're going to call in artillery. If you don't get the word, the first explosion, you head for your bunker because you know what's going on. So we rehearsed that knowingly. So we called for the artillery. The artillery missions were completed. They vacated the hill, took some of their dead, left dead behind. Bunkers were burning. Fires were burning. At that time, Puff the Magic Dragon had arrived on station, was dropping flares out and around the area, called for medevacs, searched the bunkers to see if anybody else was in, located the dead. It was all under illumination, just like daylight now, with all the daylight and everything. And we started accounting for our people and standing by in case there's another attack. Called for medevacs, got the dead down, 10 of them. Well, the artillery was being called from Hill 52. Whether they dropped additional rounds out there, I don't know. I requested VT and that went off. They may have fired a couple extra rounds to catch them in the retreat or whatever. I never called for any HE at all. It was all VT. I never talked to the captain. I talked to the hill, whoever was on that radio. I'm sure the captain was monitoring. He was expecting to get hit as well, so he had to stay there. If they'd have come down, they would probably been ambushed because they'd had to come down Thunder Road to get to us. And I think they said they found ambush sites along that road. Puff was called and got out as quick as they could, and they fired up the area continually and circled. Oh, that was a sight to be seen. Just him, that, just like a rabbit, and they flew around the area, but they'd gotten there after the attack was already over because they had to come from a distance. Then the helicopters, it was lit up like a daylight out there. People were hollering to each other, yeah, you over there, you there, you okay? We got some people dead over here, we got dead. It was just chaos to a certain extent. and then it was just stand by. But then you had Puff circling just far in the surrounding areas. Put them in the LZ, yellow smoke pop, wounded out first. I think the dead was closer to daylight. At first light, I could look over and see the bunkers burning, dead laying around. And at that point, I looked up at the sky and I thanked the good Lord for helping me make that decision. After the battle, they came out to the hill, the battalion commander and his staff walking around the hill, and we were pointing to the dead in there and trying to tell them what happened. And that's when the general came out with his helicopter from the rear, and he flew around the area and he saw me, which I just had an interview with him, and he saw me and looked and he gave me a thumbs up. He didn't even land, he just flew around and surveyed the area. I give him a thumbs up backwards, and quite an experience. What they did, they sent a platoon from India Company down the next day. And then the India Company came out first, but then they were relieved by Mike Company, you see. So that first night, we were there with India Company. So India Company took the lines. They said, you guys just take it easy. We got the perimeter. And then the next morning, we left. I remember because we had to hump back up to 52. Then we went up on the hill, and they put me up in the COC bunker on a cot and kept me away from the platoon. They put the rest of the platoon in a GP tent and made them administrative. You know, they was recovering from the shock while they was getting the reports of everybody after action and everything. I think I just spoke to the captain. That was it. Captain Porter. They all gave their individual testimonies. It's still in my mind. You never get over that. Lieutenant Ruane, yeah, he was on the patrol, and we were moving by a hamlet. There was a body of water to the right of us, and he hadn't been there that long. And now I was about to the rear of the platoon, and he was up toward the front. I was in the platoon sergeant position, and we come alongside this trail, this hamlet. And the time I got up there, he'd already passed through the designated kill zone. And the kill zone was designated, I knew, I could see 2 twigs. And one of them had a flyer that we dropped out on it. And that was the left limit. And then there was another one, which was the right limit. And the NVA had designated that as a killing zone, you see. He wasn't aware of that. He passed through that, and he was in the middle of the killing zone when they opened up across the other side of the body of the water. So you couldn't run a reaction force toward him. And as soon as he got in that killing zone, they opened up and killed him. And he rolled over. I rolled over into a ditch. Of course, you knew the body of water. That was easy. We'd already been through the Hill 25 artillery, and I was artillery prone on everything at that point, and I called for artillery mission on the other side of the ambush site. Of course, they'd already been going, but that's how that lieutenant was killed.
How hard was it being a father in Vietnam?
Well, I wasn't a father. I became a father in Vietnam. I wasn't here when the son was born. And then when I'd been selected for commissioning, the battalion commander asked me if I wanted to extend my tour, and I would have if I told him no. I'd almost been killed. And I said, you know and I know I'm coming back here eventually anyway, because I thought I was going to go on forever. I said, I've declined the offer. I need to go home and see my family. I said, I'll be back though. And I was counting on coming back as a lieutenant, and they put me aboard a ship. Probably saved my life.
And even after you left, some of your men continued to be killed.
Oh yeah, after I left, you know. Wayne Spare was an aggressive, muscular individual, strong, good leadership, like I say, over-aggressive. And I had to caution him many times. I said, don't be so aggressive. Do your job. If you're looking for a decoration, it'll find you. You don't go looking for it, or you're going to end up dead. That's what I told him. And I have to get on him all the time. But he's good in the respect because he's leading by example, but he was too aggressive in some respect. And he didn't hesitate. He went after him. And his squad, he had a good squad. My tour ended in January, just before Tet. Wasn't the first, probably the first week or so. I left country before I actually got it, and I was on leave and they couldn't locate me. And when I reported into MCRD, I was a staff sergeant. They assigned me to a platoon, and before I finished that platoon out, the commission came in, they finally located me, and they decorated me as a staff sergeant. They didn't want to decorate me as a lieutenant. And then I went up and got commissioned. My battalion commander and the major who I served with over there, they were on duty within the area. They were present for the promotion. Then they assigned me as a series commander. And here I'd been, my second tour as a drill instructor. It was like putting a rat in a cheese factory. They transferred me to the battalion. I was a second lieutenant. I made first lieutenant. Then they transferred me to the special training branch where we dealt with all the remedial types, fat boys, motivation, medical, academic, and correctional custody, all different platoons. And then when my tour was about to be completed, they said, well, Lieutenant, there's 2 permanent programs open. There's an LDO and there's a Marine Gunner program. Well, that was a no-brainer. I wanted to be a Marine Gunner. So I applied for that. I reported aboard ship as a lieutenant. News came that I had been selected for the gunner program, and my reporting station was Marine Barracks 32nd Street, and I went down there and I put my letter in to be reverted. I didn't want to be a lieutenant. I wanted to be a Marine gunner. I left the ship and reported to Edson Range as a range officer. Ran a range for 3 years. Upon leaving there, I was assigned to the infantry training school in 1975. I took over the recruit entry-level training section. See, I'd been everything in a recruit training environment except a recruiter. I'd been a drill instructor. I'd been series commander. I'd been assistant director of special training branch. Now I'm taking over the recruit field training at the school. I had 10 instructors. They called it the route section. Then that was phased out when MCRD took it over, and they field training now is at some range. From there, I took over a machine gun section, training machine gunners, revised the whole program. And it was, I think it was like a 4-day course, more or less like a fanfare. So what I did, I took the MCI course. If you can learn a machine gun by correspondence, I took that same sequence of instruction and put it in practical application with classroom firing, made a 2-week course out of it, and it's still in existence. I ran that for a while, and then they had the weapons all spread out, and they had a FAP lieutenant, fleet assistant lieutenant, running each one. I told the S3 officer, I said, why don't you let me have that whole weapons section, put it together. So I consolidated them. I had the 0331s, 41s, 51s, 52s, 4 gunnery sergeants, 8 staff sergeants, and the rest were corporals and sergeants for a 48-man training section. So I was in the weapons section, took over the weapons section, brought in all the new weapons, mobile training teams, lightweight company mortar, the small, the Mark 19, brought back the M50 cal machine gun, inserted in all the training. And then they wanted to form an advanced infantry training company and make the first platoon sergeant squad leader course, formal courses. The platoon sergeant course was 11 weeks long. Squad leaders were 7. Boy, I wanted to get over there. And some of the lessons I learned and some of the skills I didn't have to make sure another platoon sergeant didn't have to go through what I went through. And it was 11 weeks long. They taught every weapon in the infantry battalion. They could operate it, shoot it, demolitions, navigation, defensive, offensive tactics, orders, even writing orders. Everything that they needed to know to fill every billet in an infantry battalion, to include the assistant ops chief. They hated to write orders, and I told them the rationale and philosophy. You learn to write an order for everything that you have to do, because in the back of your mind, having written that order, you develop a sequence of steps. Now in combat, you're not going to say time out, let me write an order, but you'll know what has to be done, and you develop that skill doing that. They knew demolitions, they knew tactics, they knew how to conduct raids. We had a practical application. They write raid orders, and then they did a night raid, a night extraction. They did everything. Everything that I didn't learn, they knew, and they know now even better so. My gosh, they go into them battalions. Can you imagine having a battalion now with trained platoon sergeants, trained squad leaders, trained machine gun leaders, mortar leaders? They're all school trained now. And all we did was OJT at the Vietnam era.
So was your motivation to give them the tools that you didn't have?
I wanted to make sure that they knew what to do where I had to learn the hard way or didn't know. And I also implemented combat leadership briefs. I'd take a platoon sergeant from World War II, from Korea, and I gave them my own experience from Vietnam. And during the course of training, and I worked it, I'd take the citation. He operated a machine gun in his citation. I'd move that combat leader the night before the block of training on machine gun training. It was motivational. And I'd do that for 3 combat leaders. And I'd give combat leadership briefs that they learned from each platoon sergeant, from each era, that, hey, they all do the same job.
And from your experience, what are you really trying to instill in these platoon and company NCOs?
Well, they know their job for one reason. They have gone through all those subordinate courses before they come through the platoon sergeant. Can you imagine that? They've been through the squad leader. They've been through the infantry small unit leader course. Now they've gone through the platoon sergeant course. There's not anything they don't know. And the battalion that I'm in is the Advanced Infantry Training Battalion. They have 3 companies. They have the Infantry Unit Leader Training Company, which trains the squad leaders, platoon sergeants, and mortarmen. The mortar course is good as the Army mortar course. I mean, they know everything. And the machine guns, they learn the present machine gun, the Mark 19. They know how to use plotting boards for indirect fire with machine guns. I tell you, they know these Marines know everything.
But you stood up this course and you're still active in it today.
I sponsor awards now and recruit sponsors. I don't get involved in the training anymore. I don't want to go up there telling everybody what to do. But I'm available if they have a question. All the seasoned staff NCOs, they didn't have enough officers. So they made them all second lieutenants. Now you had no platoon sergeants. So that was a learning lesson. Another learning lesson is this rotation in and out. You had nothing but turbulence. People coming, people going, people on R&R, KIAs, WIAs. There was no stability. It was just in and out turbulence. So now when a unit goes, they go in and they go out, and that's the way it should have been. And then they set up these schools to make sure you always had that experience. Best thing ever happened was that School of Infantry. 2017, they named the combat instructor of the school trophy after me because I'd been there for so long, which is quite an honor. So,
but you wish you had this training before Vietnam.
Oh my gosh. Like I said, I tried to use some initiative before I went. I took out the correspondence courses to even become familiar with the terminology and everything. And then I'd ask returning veterans what they knew, what I should be prepared for. And I applied what I learned. I looked to the book, referred to it, and put it into action. The one thing I tried to convince the Marines, and I convinced myself earlier on, I told you, your first baptism to fire, and you're around veterans on a patrol, for example, and you get a shot or it comes close or you hear it whiz by or just the sound of incoming. You hit the deck and you feel so foolish because all the veterans are just still standing. And then eventually you're like the veterans. You're just standing, it's going, it's noise. And I used to tell the Marines all the time, I said, the one that's going to get you, you ain't never going to hear. So get used to the noise. If you hear rounds going, they're going. Keep going. And don't stop. The one that gets you, you're never going to hear. So you got to learn to overcome noise. That's the big thing in combat. And the same thing in training. You got to train with noise. Even when I had the courses up here, I'd use simulators, for example, at the school later on, using that same philosophy. Say if you wanted to attack a trench line, you did it by the numbers so that everybody knew everybody's position. And as soon as they were proficient at it, you added all the noise you could and executed then. And then you stayed on site and did it at night. Dry run it, then with everything, and then even declare some casualties in the process. So you simulate all those things that you're going to encounter. Noise is the biggest thing to overcome in combat, in my opinion. And you don't practice enough, well, we didn't enough in peacetime. Now you want all the noise you can have to execute. It's been an experience and it continues to be one. And lo and behold, here I am at the School of Infantry telling that story to all the young Marines. I used to pass out a dog tag to each and every student that heard it, 60,000 of them. Used to train 19 companies from MCT, or as you were, 31 and 18 ITB companies a year in that classroom up there. And I told that story and they got a dog tag. The dog tag had a Marine Corps emblem on the front. On the back was from the book of Joshua 1:9. says, I will be strong and courageous. I'll not be terrified or discouraged, for the Lord my God is with me wherever I go. And whenever you have anxiety, a tough call to make, you repeat that scripture and it'll see you through. My own dog tag experience in the battle, I had a dog tag attached to my flak jacket. And after the battle, I put my flak jacket on, and there was a round that had been fired through that dog tag. Through that dog tag. And I carry it to this day. I'm sure that's the one that was meant for me. Now, I did have other closer calls. I had a heel shot off my boot as I ran across the rice paddy one time. I've been knocked down to the ground on many explosions. And the good Lord has certainly blessed me in more ways than one, and He still does to this day. And I still read them scriptures every morning. And I say a prayer for those 13 Marines that were killed every day. Story goes on, about that. The truly courageous do not live in anxiety from morning to night. They are calm because they know who they are. Marines overcome our natural fear of injury and death and fight for three main reasons. First, we're well trained and well led. Second, we have conviction that will sustain us to the last sacrifice. Third, we fight for each other. In short, if you're going to go down fighting. It is better to die bathed in valor than to perish with a whimper. And never, ever give up. Winners never quit, and quitters simply die.